right, we are going to discuss a recent case. Hasn't been resolved yet. Don't know how it's going to all play out, but it can give you an example of just how messy some of these contracts can get in these shared work environments. So in 2012, Disney bought Lucasfilms. So they got basically the Star Wars franchise and all of the things that went along with it. So they got the Star Wars universe. So they got the intellectual property rights to the books. I'm sure they got merchandise rights, movie rights. All of the canon now moves from Lucasfilms to Disney. Okay, so they have that contract. Now, there were already existing contracts with Lucasfilms with, let's say, their writers. So they already had those contracts. So Disney basically inherited the existing contracts with the intellectual property rights. So the writers who had contributed to the Star Wars universe before the acquisition all of a sudden found themselves in a little precarious situation, as they were promised in these pre-existing contracts that they were going to get ongoing royalties for their work, and all of a sudden they weren't getting paid. So it's like, time out. Hold on. My original contract says that I'm going to get XYZ royalties. So the core of the issue is apparently inadequate contracts. I haven't reviewed the contracts, so I can't tell you exactly what in there is an issue. But the heart of the dispute is the inadequacy of contracts governing the royalty payments for the writers. The contracts that were in place when Lucasfilms was an independent entity were not designed to address the complexities that were introduced once that IP was absorbed by Disney in the acquisition. As a result, Disney faced challenges in honoring these contracts due to discrepancies and ambiguities in the terms related to royalties and intellectual property rights. So if Disney attorneys are going through and reading these individual writer contracts, apparently there was enough gray area in the terms of royalty payments that Disney's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be paying here. So they kind of paused all of that. So the legal developments, so the halted payments, several writers have filed lawsuit against Disney and Lucasfilms, and the lawsuits argue that Disney's failure to uphold the royalty agreements violated the terms of the original contracts. The plaintiffs claim that the abrupt stop in the payments constitutes a breach of contract, and they seek compensation for lost royalties and damages for the legal breach. So then the issue of contract ambiguities. So one significant issue raised in these legal actions is the ambiguity of and inadequacy of the original contracts. Many of these contracts did not account for the possibility of a major acquisition or changes in the management of the intellectual property. And so as a result, there were disputes over how the royalties should be calculated and distributed under the new ownership structure. So that's the issue. Disney's defense, and we know Disney has an army of attorneys who can do stuff like apply a Disney Plus contract to a Death in the Park, which, by the way, was both evil and genius. So I guess Disney is an evil genius. We'll just say that. So Disney, on its part, has argued that the contracts inherited from Lucasfilms are complex and unclear. The company claims that it has made efforts to honor the spirit of the agreements, but has faced difficulties due to the outdated and insufficient nature of the contracts. Disney's defense also includes arguments about the legal and logistical challenges involved in transitioning Lucas's legacy systems to Disney's more standardized practices. So I assume the way this is all going to shake out, and I'm not 100% sure, is that probably all of these writer contracts are probably going to be renegotiated under Disney, and that is going to be a very lengthy arbitration. I think it'll probably settle outside of court. I think it's more complex than, to dive into the details of it. I think it's like going to be a contract for contract issue. I think they're going to have to go in and look at, Disney attorneys are going to have to look at every contract. But it doesn't change the fact that obviously there's a financial hardship for the original writers. That they, a lot of times they were expecting that money to come in as income, and now they're not getting it. And who knows how long this is going to be tied up in litigation. Like I said, they're probably going to have to go through each contract individually. And that's going to be a lengthy process. And in the meantime, these writers aren't getting paid. Sure, they might get a payout for it later on, which that will probably be also negotiated. But who knows? This does have industry-wide implications, particularly concerning how the intellectual property rights and contractual obligations are managed during acquisitions. So there are repercussions here on how this needs to move forward. And it's kind of a wake-up call to similar industries on the need for clear and comprehensive contracts that anticipate these potential changes in ownership and management. Again, I said it's hard writing a contract to think of all of these things, but you have to at least consider, like I said, consider the worst and hope for the best. So they're probably going to have, like I said, the solutions are going to be ongoing negotiations. So they want to resolve and address the grievances of the writers while allowing Disney to streamline its operations. So they're going to have to come up with some sort of a compromise. Again, potential outcomes could be revised contracts, retroactive payments, settlement to compensation to compensate the affected writers. And then there are probably going to be some legal reforms and industry practices. I think advocates for writers and intellectual property professionals are pushing for clearer guidelines and more equitable practices in contract drafting and management. And I think this happens especially with writers and artists. I think that a lot slips through the cracks, and it could be that these, if these writers lose, they get nothing, and that happens a lot. But you're going up against Disney attorneys, it's a high-powered billion-dollar organization that has an army of attorneys to throw at these little writers, that, while they may be successful writers, they don't pull in the money that Disney pulls in to be able to hire, a high-powered legal team. And so you're getting an entire industry of these writers and artists who are waking up and saying, you know what, we are tired of being stepped on by corporate America, and it is time to clarify these contracts. And I've joined a couple groups that are kind of advocating for these clarity in the contracts and offering like some contract templates, things to look for, offering to review those contracts. But there's a lot more support there now than what there used to be whenever these Star Wars authors originally wrote their books. Whenever you're talking about, like, you go back to like the early days of Marvel or the early days of TSR or Dungeons and Dragons, there are countless times where the writers and the artists have just been hosed, and it's because the contracts are so unclear and they're vague. And again, you're up against a monster once that company grows to a certain level and they can have an army of attorneys to just go at you legally, and you don't have the money or the time. I mean, not only are these writers are not getting paid, so maybe they can't afford an attorney because they're not getting paid. It's a vicious circle. And this is why there are starving artists, is because of shit like this. And so it's time as a wake-up call to the entire industry, to writers, to artists out there, anybody who's creative. This is your wake-up call. Stand up, and you have to advocate for yourself, and you have to educate yourself on these rights that you have, and make sure that you're exercising them, to make sure that the companies stop doing this shit. Stand up and be a voice. And if we all stand together, then, we're definitely going to get somewhere. So just keep an eye on this particular. I mean, like I said, it's not going to resolve for years. I'm anticipating it being settled in arbitration outside of court. I don't even know if it'll go to court. I think they'll settle. And we may never hear what the outcome is because it's going to be such a small news story because they're going to try to settle it under the table, and keep it out of the news because it's bad press for Disney, bad press for Star Wars. Although we live in a generation where bad press is almost as good as good press, just as long as you're in the media, it seems. But that's a conversation for another day. But just make sure you are protecting yourself when it comes to signing a contract. Don't just sign it because it sounds great. Make sure there's a contract. Make sure that it's a clear contract, especially when it comes to the things that I've outlined, your termination, your rights, and your royalties.